And I'll start by saying that tonight's shiur is Le'ilu Nishmat Avimori Dover Meir Ben Reuven Halevi Imi Maroti Rachel Bat Harav Michael. And of course, tonight we're talking about parshat mishpatim. And I think tonight's theme is basically the unity of the oral law and the written law, and how our parsha, more so perhaps than many of the other parshiot, really makes that crystal clear in its wording and in its understanding. So we're going to go right to the text of parshat mishpatim. And we're going to start by talking now. Again, parshat mishpatim, as we know, talks about I guess primarily talks about, at least at the beginning, about civil law, and there are some rather interesting halachot that really drive home the importance of the Torah Shebaal Peh, the complementary part of the Torah that was not committed originally to writing, that was originally given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe on Har Sinai, and was passed down ish mi ish by word of mouth, by teaching, by practice, for roughly the first, I guess, 1,000 years after Matan Torah, until it was committed to writing in circa the 2nd century by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi as the Mishnah, and ultimately a number of centuries later, the Gemara. So we'll start with one of the psukim in this week's parsha, which is seems to be a very interesting pasuk. We are talking about damages, cases where one person damages another, or one person's property damages another, and the pasuk clearly says, this is Shmot, this is in this week's parsha, Perek Chaf Aleph, pasuk Lamed Hey, says the following: V'chi yigof shor ish et shorei ehu v'meit, which very simply says that if a person's ox, an ox belonging to one person, shall bodily harm a ox belonging to another person, his friend, and kill him. So in other words, ox number one belonging to party number one gores, body slams, body rams, whatever, some other type of interaction. Ox number two belonging to owner number two. And ox number two dies. They have to take the living ox, the one that did the damage, and the dead ox, sell them both, and split the money. Now, if I were to look at this without any understanding, this seems to be a rather arbitrary way of handling damages. In which case, for example, if the living ox happens to be worth, say, $1,000, the dead ox was only worth, when it was alive, $20, suddenly the owner is getting recompensed for his $20 ox, $500. Seems rather exorbitant price to pay for minimal damages. And in the converse case, where the ox that does the damage is only worth $20, and the ox that was damaged even after death, let's say, is worth $100 for the meat, the owner of the ox that does the damage seems to be gaining. He would be getting $50 by just from the half of the meat that was sold from the dead animal. So this seems to be a rather arbitrary decision-making process, and clearly cannot be, because in some cases, as we see, we have very, very different outcomes that don't seem to fit our idea of what the Torah would expect from a perspective of justice. And Rashi very, very clearly gives us the appropriate Talmudic interpretation. In the first 3 words, he says very simply, B'shavim hakatuv medaber. The parsha is talking about 2 oxen that before the damages occurred were worth the same amount. And therefore, when we say that we split the value of each of them, each one is going to receive a reasonably equitable distribution. Rashi goes through the entire passage from the Talmud that explains this whole thing as teaching us the principles of how we collect the damages. So there are a number of different principles that are established by the Talmud in this case, all of which Rashi goes through. It's a rather, as you can see, it's a rather long Rashi. He goes through all of the different cases. But the point that Rashi makes, as I said, is really in the first three words. The fact is, if we don't have that key, those three key words that the Torah here is talking about, two oxen that are worth the same value, if we don't have that key, this whole section seems ridiculous. Once we have that, suddenly it all falls into place. And that really is the purpose of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, to elucidate the text of the Torah Shebichtav to the extent that we can now fully comprehend and understand exactly what it's trying to teach us. And so the complementary part of the Torah Shebichtav is the Torah Sheba'al Peh. And we can go in and try to understand why is it that the Torah Shebichtav was written and the Torah Sheba'al Peh was not written. But I think the key point is to understand that we need both of them. We can't say, well, let's only have the Torah Shebichtav, or let's only have the Torah Sheba'al Peh, or but we need to have both of them complementing each other so that we can fully understand what it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu expects of us, if we are judges in this case, but even in terms of virtually every mitzvah in the Torah, everything that might seem to us to be clearly black and white, it's not so black and white. So I'm going to give one other example, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about some other things. But the next example also from this week's parsha is a very, very similar case, similar occurrence where, again, we're talking about laws of damages and laws of watchmen and people who are paid or not paid to watch something. So we have two sections, one of which follows the other. The first one begins in Pasuk Vav of Shemot Parak Vav, which says the following: Kitain ish el re'ehu kesef o kelim lishmor v'gunav mi beit ho'ish im yimatzeh ganav yishalim shnayim. A person gives his friend silver or money or utensils to watch, and they are stolen from his house. If the thief is found, the thief has to pay double restitution. That's a general principle in the Torah, that anybody who steals something has to pay back, not only return the original item that he stole, but also has to pay a fine of called kefel, a double fine, which the Torah imposes upon him. Presumably, the Torah places this fine upon the person as a deterrent for robbery, because it seems to be a yetzer hara that is very, very prevalent. Okay, but then the Torah continues and says in Pasuk Zayin, Im lo yimatzeh haganav v'nikrav balabait el Elokim im lo shalach yado b'mlachet re'ehu. If the person who was watching the item claims it was stolen, but nobody was found, no thief has been found, so the owner now comes to the court and questions and tries to find proof that the person who was watching it did not utilize it himself, so that it was lost. And then the Torah continues that and really doesn't tell us what happens to happen. It says, there may be times where the watchman has to pay twice to the owner, but it doesn't clarify what each of these cases are, and it really doesn't give us closure on what it is it's talking about and what the final judgment is here. Then we get into another chapter which begins very similarly. Kitain isho re'ehu, if a person gives to his friend, chamor o shor o sev v'chol behema lishmor. Here, he's giving him, instead of giving him money or utensils, or he's giving him an animal, a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any animal to watch, umate and it dies, onishbar, or it's broken, onishbar, or it's captured, ein roeh, and nobody saw what happened to this animal. And here it says, Shavuot Hashem tiyeh ben shnehem, that there must be an oath of Hashem between the two of them. Im lo shalach yado b'mlechet re'ehu. Again, that same verse of lo shalach yado b'mlechet re'ehu. He did not stretch forth his hand against something that belonged to his friend. V'lukach bi'alav v'lo yishalem. But the owner has to take it, and does not have to pay. The watchman does not have to pay. However, in verse 11, it says, if it's stolen from him, he has to repay the original owner. Okay, and then it ends if it's torn from him, he has to bring proof that it was torn, but he does not have to pay for the animal that was torn from him. Now, again, all of this is pretty cryptic if we don't have the Torah Shebaal Peh to help us explain it. Why, in the first case, are there two different cases here, and why do they seem to have two different dispositions in terms of how they are dealt with? And again, Rashi provides us some of the answer. Right at the top, he says that Parsha Rishona Nemru B'Shomer Chinam, Lefikach Patar Bo Et Hagneva, that since the first section that we read deals with a watchman who you gave something to watch, but you did not offer to pay him. He's doing you a favor. And therefore, his degree of responsibility for watching is less than the person who you might be paying. So therefore, he is only responsible to make sure that he does not utilize the item or does not totally and completely neglect it. But if he watches it well enough and it ends up getting stolen, he does not have to pay. He merely has to take an oath that he did not neglect it and he did not use the item, and he does not have to pay. However, Parsha Shneah, the second parsha, Amura B'Shomer Sachar, is written concerning a watchman who is paid. Lefikach eino pater im nignava. He has to watch it better so that if it's stolen, he is responsible. Since he is being paid to watch this item by me, therefore he has an obligation to pay for it if it is stolen. Again, the differences here are clear once we have that code words here, that the first one is talking about a shomer chinam, and the second one is talking about a shomer sachar, a one who is paid. Again, without those code words, without that interpretation or that perspective to look at these parshiot, they seem again not to be clear. And I think this is true, as I said, about every parsha in the Torah. Whether we talk about something that seems to be as straightforward as lo tirtzach, you shouldn't commit murder. Nonetheless, we have to find out what the parameters of murder are. When is taking another person's life permitted? When is it obligatory? And when is it forbidden? Because each of those, anytime I take someone else's life, according to somebody, I am murdering somebody. According to somebody else, I'm doing society a favor. So we have to understand that the Torah has parameters for each of these categories, for even things that, as I said, we might be seen by us as, quote, straightforward and fairly obvious. Clearly, when we get into things like Shabbat and understanding all of the nuances of Shabbat and what is considered milacha, clearly we might have a better perspective as to why we need the oral Torah. But as I said, in each of these cases, the necessity of the Torah Shebaal Peh to complement the Torah Shebichtav is such an important portion of the Torah that we have to accept on faith. We have to have the faith that the Torah Shebaal Peh is accurately transmitted, has been accurately transmitted, and continues to be accurately transmitted, because without it, we cannot understand the Torah. in terms of, as I said, if we go through trying to understand why is it that certain parshiot are written and certain parshiot are not, I think it gives us, we need, in order to fully understand that, we have to understand why it is or how it is that the Torah was taught. And if we go back to the Gemara explains that in general, the transmission of the oral Torah happened in a setting that was half theoretical, half practical. So that around Pesach time, the rabbis would sit down and they would give lectures on the laws of Pesach, because they're coming up. You're going to need to know them. It's been a year since you've had to apply them, and we now need to review them. The same thing with all of the halachot, which is why that sometimes we will find the Gemara describing a specific halacha was forgotten because it hadn't been used in a while. One of the simple cases that the Gemara in Psachim that we just learned recently in Daf Yomi describes the case of when Erev Pesach fell on Shabbat, which happens this year. But it doesn't happen all that frequently that Erev Pesach is Shabbat. And there are different halachot in the time of the Beit HaMikdash for how the Korban Pesach had to be brought when it was being brought on Shabbat. And the Chachamim at the time, the Bnei B'Teira, who were the head of the Sanhedrin, at that point forgot what the halacha was. And they looked and they tried to find somebody who might remember what the halacha was, because it was something that, even though it had been practiced, and it was practiced, but it hadn't come up in such a long time that they had forgotten it. And this is why the criticality of ultimately writing down the oral traditions had to happen, because of the political climate, because of the fact that the Jews were no longer all centered and focused in the same area, and ultimately had to be written down. And this aspect of teaching the traditions in the context of their practice was a very critical component to maintaining A, Jewish identity, B, Jewish continuity, and C, continuity of the halacha. So all of these are important, and I think I wanted to also quote a very, very well-known Gemara that gives us another aspect of understanding the importance of the Torah Shebal Peh. So this is a story that comes from the Gemara Shabbat, Daf Lamed Aleph, that tells us the following. Tana Rabbanan. Maaseh ben Achriya Chad sheba lifnei Shammai. This non-Jewish person came to Shammai, Amar Lo, and he asked him, Kama Torot yesh lachem? How many different Torahs do you have? Amar Lo. So Shammai answered him, Shtayim. We have two: the Torah Shebichtav, the written Torah, and the Torah Shebal Peh, and the oral Torah. Amar Lo, so the non-Jew answered him, Shebichtav ani mamincha. Concerning the written Torah, I believe you. Everybody knows you have a written Torah because you guys carry around this Torah scroll all the time. Aval Shebal Peh ani mamincha. But concerning the oral Torah, I think that's all a bunch of rabbis made it up. I don't believe you. However, he said, I want you to gaireni al menat shetalamdeni Torah shebichtav. I want you to convert me on the condition that you're only going to teach me the written Torah. I don't want to hear any of this oral Torah nonsense. Just teach me the written Torah, and I want to become a Jew. But only that way. Go arbo votziu b'nezifa. So Shammai gets upset and basically throws him out. I don't have time to waste for this nonsense. Leave me alone. Balifnei Hillel, but he comes before Hillel, Gaya Reha, and he converted him. And we have to understand, wait a minute, what do you mean he converted him? He said he was only going to accept half of the Torah. How can we convert somebody who isn't willing to accept all of the Torah? So Yom Echad, so Hillel obviously had an understanding of how to get this person to understand the importance of the oral Torah, and I think this is why the Gemara brings this whole story down. Yoma Kama Amarle. The first day Hillel started teaching him, he taught him Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. He taught him the letters. He taught him this is the first thing you have to know, second thing you have to know, third thing you have to know. Lemachar, but the next day, when he came to next day's lessons, Apichle, he switched it all around. He taught him something exactly different. Amarle, so this would-be convert says, "Till wait a minute. Yesterday, didn't you tell me the other? You told me the exact opposite yesterday. How can you switch it from one day to the next? What's going on here? How am I supposed to learn anything if one day you tell me black and the next day you tell me white?" Amar lo, he said to him, Lav olai didika samachta. Don't you have to rely on me to teach you? Isn't that the whole? Isn't that what you just said? You have to rely on me to teach you. Dalpeh nami samechlai. So concerning the Torah, Shemal Peh, you're also going to have to trust me. So basically, what Hillel is pointing out is that in order for us to learn anything, whether it's the simple basic Hebrew language that we need to understand the Torah, or the more complex aspects of understanding the Torah, in any case, we need to have a proper teacher. And since we have to trust the teacher to be able to teach us the alphabet and the words and the understanding of the words, we also have to trust the teacher to understand the explanations that were part and parcel of the oral Torah. A very, very interesting insight that Hillel wants us all to understand. This is, of course, why the Gemara records this story. Although it's interesting because it's recorded in the context of another, even more well-known story, which follows in the Gemara of the person who comes, which is the next story in the Gemara. The person comes before Shammai and says, "I want you to convert me on the condition that you teach me all the Torah while I'm standing on one foot." And he throws him out, and Hillel then tells him, what basically says, Allah saneh lachavech lo tavid. What you don't want somebody to do to you, don't do to somebody else. And this is the entire Torah. Now you have to go and study to be able to understand all the consequences and all the aspects of that. Which, as I said, is probably more famous than the first story about the one who wants to learn the whole Torah while without learning the Torah Sheval Peh. But both of these stories are in the same section of the Gemara. There's also a third story about a convert who comes to Shammai and says, "I want you to convert me on the condition that I can become the Kohen Gadol." Shammai throws him out. He comes to Hillel with the same story, and Hillel says, "Okay," and then he starts teaching him, and ultimately he comes to the verse where it talks about a person who is a non-Kohen Gadol going to try to do avodah in the Beit HaMikdash, and he realizes that he obviously can't be. He's not a Kohen. He can't come to do the avodah. And ultimately, thanks Hillel, all three of these, the Gemara concludes, all three of these individuals got together, and all of them thanked Hillel for having the patience to put up with their original mishigas, and yet he did not throw them out and not let them to become Jews. Obviously, all three of them were satisfied with their decision to become Jews, even after they understood the consequences and all of the different nuances. So again, the Gemara puts all of those in almost in a section that tries to show us the absolute and incredible patience of Hillel and his understanding of human nature in a very, very profound way. But I think, as I said, that the fact that it brings this whole story in the concept of the Torah Shebechtav and the Torah Shebal Peh also is to show us the importance of making sure that if we are truly dedicated to learning Torah, to living Torah, to absorbing Torah so that it can become part and parcel of who we are and how we live our lives, we have to make sure that we have appropriate teachers who are teaching us the authentic tradition, because without appropriate teachers, because if you have to trust your teacher and your teacher is not an appropriate teacher, then you're going to end up learning the wrong thing. And I think that's a critical component that we have to put all of our Torah teachers, all of our role models to that standard. We have to hold them to a high standard, because we are implicitly trusting that what they are doing is correct, which is why when we find somebody who is purportedly a Torah scholar or a Torah teacher, acting inappropriately, it's a much greater chilul Hashem than an ordinary person who might be doing the same thing. I mean, we always talk about the gravity of chilul Hashem, but because we, as Hillel points out very clearly, we have to rely on our teachers and our role models to be authentic. When they are not, it is a much greater tragedy. And I think all of us, to the extent that we influence, certainly with it, our children, our grandchildren, and those about us, in the way that we not just teach, but the way we observe and live Judaism. I think we are role models, and we have to be aware that if we can't or we aren't ready to commit to being authentic role models, we are going to end up with unauthentic students and let's say people who we are modeling, people who are following our lead, and therefore it behooves everyone to do the best they can to try to make sure that they are as authentic as possible in their, not just their teaching of Torah, but their living of Torah. And when we're able to do that, then we can properly influence others, and we will ultimately merit to Gula Shlema Bimheira Yameinu. Thank you all, and I hope this is, that we're all doing okay, and we should all continue to stay healthy. I now open the floor up for questions, comments, feedback, etc.